So the first thing is I want to talk about a little bit about where I came from. So my plan here is I'm going to talk about where I came from, some of the stuff I did, how we used open source, and I'm going to give you guys some of the lessons that I learned in this journey. How many of you guys know who this is or who these people are? Every one of you should have your hands up. What's wrong with you? Okay, so this is my first computer. I had an Apple IIc, and I used the heck out of that computer. How many of you have read this book? Another one where all of your hands should be up. Okay, so it's a really good book. So I read this book and I was like, wait a minute. I'm a hacker. Like, I want to be a hacker. And why? It was all of these things, like sharing, openness, collaboration, engaging in the hands-on imperative. I don't really know what engaging in the hands-on imperative is. I copied this from Wikipedia. But the thing about this is, this sounds very familiar to open source, right? And this is from, when was this written? 83, 84? And so, I mean, this has been going on a long time. But I realized through all of this that I'm a hacker. And this was great. This was a great thing to realize because it kind of gave me this cultural identity to say, look, I can solve these problems. I can fix things. And it really powered me as a rocket off. So some time passes, and I eventually find myself at a company called Threadless. How many of you guys know Threadless? Okay, how many of you guys have ever bought a Threadless shirt? So when I was there in 2009, everyone's hands would have been up. I think I was the key for the success. Anyway, so we invented crowdsourcing, or we were told that we invented crowdsourcing. We once went to MIT, and we were at this conference, and they were like, so Threadless over here, they invented crowdsourcing. And we were like, crowd what? We had no idea what they were talking about because all we were doing was trying to solve this really cool problem, which was taking really neat designs like this and putting them on a shirt like that so people can buy them. But the idea is we didn't actually want to do any of the work. So we made 4 steps. The first one was getting people like you to design the shirts. The second one was then having people like you submit them and then score them, and then cash money falls from the sky. So this is a pretty easy formula. And so the idea here is a person would get an idea, they would submit it and put it on this design on the shirt. We'd talk about it, we would score it, and then if it won, we would pay that person real money. So we had hundreds of thousands of designs that were uploaded and submitted. Millions of votes on these things, and we sold millions of t-shirts. We grew from X millions to XX millions. I was recently told I can't talk about revenue. So this is how I am able to do this. You can get the idea. But the best thing is we did none of the work. We put all the work to you guys. Crowdsource. Let you guys do all the work because they're for you. And it was awesome. And so I want to talk a little bit about our stack. Our stack was pretty straightforward. We were PHP plus an opcode cache. It was fast. It was easy. We used RHEL. It was stable. I'm not a huge fan of RHEL because I'm not a huge fan of Yum. We used MySQL. That was easy and understood. It was very this is like 2005. This was like LAMP. But the reason that we use this is because we wanted to create a technology stack that didn't get in the way of our engineers. And in 2005, this allowed us to focus on the product, which was the most important thing we could focus on. So we did all this. It grew a bunch, and I basically accomplished all my goals. So I did what any natural person would do. I quit. Which, I mean, I don't know if you guys, once you accomplish your goals, if you just quit, but that's really what I do. So I went on a vision quest, and I wandered around the Earth. This is actually a picture from the Mars rover, and I didn't quite make it there, although I tried really hard. But I did make it here, which is honestly, if you go back to Threadless when I quit, this is about as far as Mars. I did not think this would happen, and it really one thing led to another, and I met this guy, Michael Slaby. And Michael Slaby was a CTO in 2008, and if you notice, Michael Slaby, he looks like a political guy, not this guy. So this is one of my favorite slide transitions in the world. So anyway, I was a CTO in 2012, and there was a lot of things that we kind of thought about, like why Harper? And so I was describing to my wife kind of the plan, which I'll get into in a minute. And she was telling me this, which I don't read Japanese, so I was like, what? And then she said this, mochi wa mochi ya. And what this means is very simply, if you want rice cakes, go to the rice cake dealer. Or if you want engineering, you're going to have to hire engineers. And that was what the campaign did. They wanted to hire engineers. Well, so this makes sense to us, right? We're like, well, you need engineering. But you have to think about a campaign. A campaign is largely an anachronistic thing. They still knock on doors. They still send mail. They make calls to landlines. How many of you who are under 40 have ever done those things? Okay, 4 people. This is not winning. And so engineering is not native. And so they thought, we need native engineering. And so that's when they got me. And so what did I do? Well, I created a culture of code. I hired 40 engineers. I hired them from these companies. My favorite, of course, is the one in the green. Overall, we had about 120 tech staff. So that includes analytics, IT, DevOps, design, and front end. We had 18 months. We started from 0. So think about building a $1 billion enterprise in 18 months from 0. What is the first thing you're going to do? Well, execution. Well, this is this is an actual cake that was made during the last couple days, and one of our guys brought it in, and we were like, well, we can't eat this. Because what would happen if we lost? Like, you'd feel really bad if you ate that cake. So anyway, the first thing we did was we built a platform, as I guess you do. And so we built this platform. We called it Narwhal. And so towards the end of the campaign, there was all these articles about Narwhal. They were all wrong. This is a picture of Jim Messina, the campaign manager, as a Narwhal. So every Friday, we would have a meeting where we would kind of talk about technology. And since technology and engineering was such a new idea to bring into the campaigns, there was a pretty big trust deficit between the normal status quo and technologists. And so one of the things we tried to do to kind of bring everyone together was really engage in humor. And one of the ways we did that was we photoshopped Jim Messina's head on various different animals. And we presented them every week during our technology meeting. So this was one of the final ones. It's one of my favorites. Anyway, Narwhal was a concept. And what was the concept? Well, it was an API. And so we really looked at the API as our foundation. And the reason we needed to build that API as a foundation was because it would give us freedom. It would give us freedom to focus on the things that are most important, the products. So we built a call tool. We built dashboard, mobile apps, contribution apps. We built social apps. We built all these things on top of this API. And this is actually pretty common. You see Facebook doing this, you see Google doing this. And this goes back to why we hired from those places, because we wanted to stand on the shoulders of those giants. We didn't want to actually have to invent things. We just wanted to put things together. We had about 290 deployed products. About 200 of those were deployed weekly. This was a very crazy environment. Thousands of servers, all cloud, all AWS, and our stack was pretty fun. So, we used Python, Ruby, and PHP, but we threw some other things in there. MySQL was a huge component, but we also threw a bunch of other things in there as well. We used StatsD and Graphite. How many of you guys know StatsD and Graphite? You should all know this. It's an amazing way to just throw values into a bucket and display them in real time, especially if you're trying to graph performance. This is an amazing way to build dashboards. We use Puppet for deploy automation, and we use Vagrant to automate our dev environments, which also made everything great. So we also used Ubuntu. I love Ubuntu. I actually just really love apt, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway, the OFA framework is a framework that I call use all the things. And the reason is because we were very simply just focusing on what simply solves the problem. We weren't trying to do what was cool. We weren't trying to do what was easy. We just wanted to do what was solving the problem. The Node.js you saw in there was the only cool thing, and that was because they wouldn't let me actually code, so I used Node.js. But here's an example of just doing what solves the problem. Our contribution apps, which pushed about $300 million in donations through online sources, was written in PHP by 2 guys. Our huge API was written in Python. All of our front-end apps were written in Ruby. We're using Rails. We used Flask on the Python side. And the reason we did all those things is because we just wanted what would solve the problem the quickest. We wanted to be as quick to the problem solving as possible. We didn't want to have to figure out or test or think about a new technology. One thing about that is failure was not an option. When I walked in there, the first thing they said was what was on that cake. And they said, don't do that. And so I thought, what can we do to ensure that failure was not an option? The first thing we did is we invested greatly in user experience. This was something that I personally, it was not native to me to do this, but I knew that I needed someone to run this product. And so I hired what I think was the first full-time user experience person on a political campaign. The next was we practiced a lot, game day. And I'll get into both of these in a little bit. We practiced failure for a month. So all of October, we constantly iterated and practiced failure from our entire full stack, from the front end to the back end, killing databases, killing servers, taking away different third-party services, and just making sure that everything worked if those things didn't. So on E-Day, E-Day was pretty awesome. This was pretty much the idea for E-Day. But we couldn't change anything more. We just had to kind of exist. And so it was pretty chill. I mean, sort of, right? But we won. That was great. So there's a couple of learnings real quick. I want to throw in this little lesson that really saved me. Does anyone know who this is? This is John Maeda. He is the head of ReedYouTube. He came into the campaign, like seriously ran in, visited me, and told me this thing. He said, manage by your outbox, not by your inbox. The idea is if you're ever in, and I think oftentimes this happens as engineers, we kind of screw this up. If you're ever in kind of a political situation, little p, not capital P, if you're ever in a little p politics situation where maybe you have some problems with a coworker, maybe there's a manager that you don't get along with, one of the things that I found that really helped me was managing by your outbox, meaning send them emails and ask them how things are going. Don't wait for them to email you. This was incredibly valuable for me, and I really, every time I talk, I try and talk about this because of how much it helped me. So anyway, going back to the presentation, I want to leave you, after I've told you a little bit about where I came from and some of the fun stuff we did, with 3 important lessons that I've learned. The first one is how to build a great team. That's one of the most important things, and I'll go through that a little bit. The second one is how to practice failure. This is kind of unintuitive, but the idea of engaging and jumping right into failure will really help you be successful. And the third one, obviously, we all know, and I'll get into a little bit, is use open source. So the first thing on building a great team, the innovation with OFA, the innovation with Threadless was the team. And this goes through and through. It doesn't matter if it's tech, or if it was design, or if it was management. The team really helped out. But building a team, how many of you guys have tried building a team, whether it's for a product or a project or for fun? How many of you thought it was really easy? Okay, so we have a liar right there. Anyone else? So I have some, this is how I do it. And hilariously, actually, a lot of these tips come from Donald Rumsfeld, which was a really surprise for me as I'm Googling my own words, and I'm just like, huh. Anyway, number one thing is pruning. You can't be afraid to fire people. This is probably the hardest lesson that I have learned in all of my years of management, is that you have to get rid of people if they're bad, poisonous, etc. And oftentimes, there's an opportunity to hire them again. So for instance, at Threadless, we let this one guy go, and we hired him again at OFA because we knew he didn't fit in there, but we knew he would fit in at OFA. So it doesn't mean that the relationship is over. It just means that in this situation, they're not working. This could be for a product, a project, or as your team or employee, whatever. The second one, and this is really important, always be closing. This is, I mean, when you're talking about what you're doing, you constantly have to hustle on what you are trying to convince people to do. So I'm saying, Mark, I want you to come and join my team. I can't just say, it's really cool. Like, you have to really close that. And the next thing is you have to be creative about it, because there's a lot of people who are also trying to hire Mark, or also trying to get Mark to participate in a project. This goes to another one of my favorite ABCs, which is also from Rumsfeld, which is A's hire A's and B's hire C's. So always hire people who are better than you, no matter what. And never be worried that they're going to take over your job or anything like that, because probably they don't care. They care about hacking on whatever you're hiring them to hack on. They don't care about being a manager, promise me. If they do, you tell them it sucks. Next thing is trust. Trust is obviously very, very important. One thing I like to do whenever I talk about this in front of people is I'd love you guys to tell me afterwards why you think trust is important. Because I know it's very important, and I try and instill trust in all of my employees, all of my collaborators, everything about that, so that we can have that relationship. But I don't have a lot of good anecdotes about why trust is important. So I'd love you guys to help me with that. Measure everything. I referenced StatsD and Graphite previously. This is a graph from Graphite. But one of the things that we did is we measured everything aggressively. Every single metric we could, we measured, so that we could talk about success. So we could talk about failure. So I can say, to one of my engineers or to a friend that I'm collaborating with, hey, this thing should go up instead of down, or whatever. But that leads to this one, which is measure success. Talk about success. If you have a win, talk about a win. It can be very small or very big. One of the things we did on the campaign is every Friday we had a retro. And all we did in that retro was talk about our wins. Every Friday we celebrated all of the little wins we had for that previous week. And if you're running a product, you're running a project, you have just a bunch of friends collaborating on something, celebrating those weekly wins will be very positive and very successful. And every Friday you're like, yeah, let's do it. And you're ready for the next week because you're so excited about what happened previously. Even if things get dark, this is a great opportunity to talk about what was there. Credit. Success is very related to credit. Give credit where it's due. I try and be very positive, so I don't want to give credit when people screw it up. I don't want to be negative about that. I want to be like, hey, that was great that worked out. That was Mark. I'm using Mark as an example because I know Mark. But most important, continue shipping. We talk a lot about iterative development. We talk a lot about releasing, ship early, ship often, fail fast, all this stuff. The main reason why that is because it's fun to ship. And your teams will evaporate. Your collaborations will fail if you're not pushing code out, pushing product out. How many people have a product that's sitting on their laptop that no one has seen? Come on, put them up. Okay, so me too. We need to release those things because that's how we're going to get people to work with us. That's how we're going to get people excited about it. But building a team is really hard, but it's definitely worth the difficulty. When you find that success and the team gels together, whether it's a collaboration or a company, it feels so right, and you're in that stride, and it's very exciting. Just a second. The next thing is practicing failure. This was one of the things that I had to learn. It was a hard lesson, but we can all agree with this, right? Failing sucks. So my idea was I was going to work really good to be terrible at it, failing. And I did this. This is how I did it. We invested heavily in user experience. And the reason we did this, and this is for our tech products, our APIs, as well as our user-facing things. Talk to the users. We might need to say this together. Talk to the users. Because we forget. We're just like, oh yeah, shipped. And then the users are like, WTF. I think that talking to the users really is the difference between functional and usable. You can release something that's functional and you can use it. This is almost worse than the works on my machine. Where it's like, yeah, it works. What do you mean it doesn't work? You can't log in? Oh, it logs in for me. Like, no. Having that conversation and making that feedback loop very short will make all of your products and projects, etc., better. This is especially important in open source. Because if you look at the BSD booth over there, they talk about how easy it is. Well, we know that's not true, but they have done a lot of work working with users to make it easier and easier and easier and easier. This is the same thing with OpenStack, right? They spend a lot of time talking to users who are using this collection of tools. How do we make this easier and easier and easier? And all of the successful products have spent a lot of time investing in conversations with their users, and you should too. So also testing is really important. I realized the other day this is from Groundhog Day. How many of you guys have seen Groundhog Day? Great movie. It's all about multivariate testing. The entire movie is just, and I tweeted this and it got so many retweets, but I was like, I just was watching with my wife and I was like, Hiromi, my wife, this is about multivariate testing, and she's just like, whatever. But the thing is testing and user experience testing really allowed us, both at Threadless and at the campaign, especially at the campaign, to understand where we were wrong. We'd throw something out there and it wouldn't work. That was a failure. But since we did that, and we saw it, and we were able to have that conversation, able to see how it was used, we could loop back and it would work. That was pretty good. Always rolling forward, never roll back. This is a really hard one. When you do a release, you screw it up, your kind of feeling is, well, I'm going to roll it back. I'm going to go to the previous version. My challenge for you is to roll forward, patch it, and do another release. And the reason for that is because rolling back is safe. Rolling back hurts the users. Rolling forward is better, and there's a lot of discussions about this around Etsy. How many of you guys know Etsy? Okay, that's good. Better than Threadless. But Etsy's engineering team is amazing. The CEO, Chad, used to run Brickhouse at Yahoo. Big engineering leader, was a CTO, moved to CEO. Now the CTO is Kellen. These guys are doing an amazing job talking about positive engineering, open engineering, and this is one of their mantras, is always roll forward. Fail safety is something that I think rolls all these things together. Early in the campaign, I had an opportunity to go see the last of the space shuttle launch, which I'd never seen one before. I think if someone told me how cool it was, I would have gone to all of them. But this was, of course, the last one is when I find that out. I was wandering around before the launch, and there was this museum that talked about fail safety, and they talked about this idea that no matter what happens, the astronauts need to get to Earth safely. That's the whole idea. So they're redundant to this crazy degree on every single piece of hardware, every computer, every electric device. And obviously planes do that, and all these other things do that. We don't do that. I don't know why we don't do this. Why don't we treat our users in the same way, where no matter what happens in your software, that the users come out unharmed? And so the idea here for us was every single level of error was actually just a service degradation. So if, for instance, the database was too hot, you maybe stopped displaying this map. Or if everything went terrible and you showed a 500 error, instead of saying 500 error, which is the least helpful thing in the world, you would show some sort of static screen that actually asked the user to go do something else. Or to go to Twitter and tweet at us. Or ask us a question on Quora. Or any of these kind of various things. But the idea is, rather than a hard wall, have it just bounce off somewhere else. Practice fail safety with your users. They'll appreciate it. But the most important thing is practice. I mentioned before that we did these things called game days. And the idea here was, how do we do a tabletop exercise to kind of, I'm trying to think of the right word here, just test every scenario possible. So we went through and we created a menu, and it said, at 11 a.m., we're going to remove the databases. Then we're going to put them back, obviously. And we used AWS, so we just launched a new cluster that had all of our apps running, and it was very production quality. And when I say that, I mean it was actually a production copy of all of our data, all of our servers, the same sizes, all that stuff. And then we just started killing things and just destroying everything. And so we really destroyed all of our applications in a very real way. And honestly, it really was frustrating because all of a sudden our login provider would be gone. How do the apps work without a login provider? Well, when you're trying to make sure that there's no downtime or no anything, you have to figure that out. And this was a very hard thing on our engineers. It was hard on us as kind of the designers and the managers. It was hard on the organization. But we had no downtime. And the reason for that is because for every possible path of failure or catastrophe, we just had to flip to that page in the run book and say, oh, that's on page 23. Type in those commands, and it just went. And suddenly there were no surprises. There were surprises when we tested it, though. And so that's why testing is important. So for that month, we would say, OK, let's pull the queues. And we'd pull the queues, and the queues would all die, and then all of our apps would fail. And we'd be like, well, I guess we have some work around queues. So now on open source software, obviously I don't need to talk about why this is so exciting, but I'm going to anyway. At Threadless, open source was really important because we were a very small organization that didn't have any resources, and we needed to use something that, more importantly, other people had proven to work. OFA, we had to move so fast that we needed to stand on the shoulders of all of these giants that are doing work, and we needed to be secure. For my career, my first open source experience was on Linux and using Apache in the mid-90s. And that is the same technology I'm using today. So both at Threadless and at OFA, I use Linux and Apache. And so if you can span technologies and knowledge that long, a friend of mine just tweeted, he said, the only book on my bookshelf that is still relevant is my Linux book. And this is something that's really important. And obviously your career. You guys are all here because you love open source and because this is part of your life. I've built a lot of things on top of open source, and I'm going to continue to build on top of open source. I will always do that. I can't imagine doing it another way. Hilariously, this presentation is a PowerPoint. That was a constraint of the theater, I guarantee you. There's 5 reasons that I really like open source. I'm just going to go through them real quick. So community, obviously this is an example of why this is so important. But there's another thing here, which is support, which is also this. I saw in the hallway just a minute ago, someone was having a BSD issue. I don't know why they weren't using Ubuntu. Anyway, they were having a BSD issue, and they passed the laptop to someone else to help out. That's exactly what's important here. That's exactly how it works. And although sometimes IRC can be pedantic and annoying, it still is one of the most valuable places to find support and to get information, and I love lurking there. Security. We built, for instance, a lot of our software on open standards. These open standards came bundled with, kind of inadvertently, with a lot of open source software. So for instance, our identity provider for Barack Obama was OpenID. Of course, if you used it, you noticed that it didn't work like most OpenID providers because we just didn't say enter your URL. You just clicked the login button, it did it all in the background. The thing that was nice about that, if there was a big problem in OpenID or OAuth or in these other open standards, Google, Facebook, etc. would release a notice and patch it, and we could follow them. Which leads me to the next one, which is how do we stand on the shoulders of these giants? A lot of you guys in the audience are also giants, and we stand on your shoulders as well. And so that's really one of the most important things for me. Another one that I think is talked about a little less is hiring. Both people who contribute to open source and people who are building on open source are easier hires than if they don't. If someone says, well, I've never contributed to open source, or let's say this a little differently. My favorite interview question right now is, what's your GitHub URL? People give it to me, and you can instantly kind of get an idea of how and who and what these people are. What are they working on? What's important to them? And it honestly doesn't matter if they're a designer or a C hacker. Their contributions to open source, whether it's documentation or whether it's actual kernel patches, are very important. And you can see this very easily with Bitbucket, with GitHub, with any of these sites that allow us to see what they're working on. I find this fascinating. And that is one of the only ways that we found good engineers so fast on the campaign was instantly seeing the source code that they were committing in public. It also shows what kind of person they are and how they are acting. And so this goes back to your projects that you have hidden away in your computers. Publish those, and it's kind of like a Field of Dreams thing, but it's instead of weird ghost baseball players, I guess, you get companies coming to hire you. That was a terrible analogy, wasn't it? Not invented here is something that we say oftentimes negatively about an organization who has a not invented here problem where they won't use that software. Well, this is the opposite for me, which is I love it if I don't have to do any work, right? Like, it's awesome. Like, I would die if I had to write a web server before every time we hacked some web app. I mean, that'd be terrible. And then I look at Node, right? And you're like, what? But it's like, why do you do this? I mean, and actually, some of the best web servers have built on top of other great web technologies. My favorite example of this is Tornado, which looked at kind of what Twisted was doing, what all these things were doing, and said, wait, we can build a better Python web server. And then that really set the tone for asynchronous web connections and web sockets for, and that was quite a while ago. But I try and only use things that we didn't invent, because I know that I'm not actually good at code and tech. I'm good at product. And so putting all these things together and kind of putting this puzzle together to build something that is awesome is really what we try and do. So obviously open source is awesome, right? But there's some things I want to just challenge you guys. So one of the things that's really important is understand what you're using. So really look at it and think, what is the license here? Be deliberate about the license. Is it supported? Be deliberate about whether or not it's supported. GitHub helps with this. You can see when the last commit is. You'll get trapped. So you need to be conscious. You need to be deliberate about these things. You need to respect open source. I wanted to talk about, but I didn't get a chance to, open sourcing things, because that's where I think a lot of this respect really needs to be placed. It's oftentimes more expensive than people think to open source things. Some of the saddest things out there are projects that have been abandoned, and usually that's because the original open sourcing of it didn't have the support it needed. So please respect open source. So that's pretty much it. Remember, this is all very simple. Build a great team. Practice failure, and use open source, and above all, ship. So thank you. I would love to answer a bunch of questions. I don't know if we have a mic. I'll just repeat the question. So questions? Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was, if I was rebuilding Threadless today, what kind of stack would it be? That's really hard, because both my kind of like hacker nerd side says I want to use Go, the language, because it's fun. But my practical someone else is going to have to do this later side probably says Python. And the reason for that is hosting has gotten easier for all of these things. So whether it's AWS or OpenStack once you get big, or Heroku or Engine Yard or App Engine once you're small, Python is pretty well supported. I probably wouldn't choose Rails because I'm very bad at Ruby. But if I got better at Ruby, maybe I would choose Rails because it seems like it works pretty well. Yeah?
What did you do before Threadless and what led you there?
The question is, what did I do before Threadless? I was hoping no one would ask that. I was a criminal. I was a Java programmer. Terrible. I was a Java programmer, and I worked for a company called World Book Publishing. And then I just did a lot of side projects. And so I did, I don't know if you guys remember the 3Com Audrey. Anyone remember the 3Com Audrey? It's sad. This is like tears. In the early 2000s, there was a 3Com Audrey, and it was a little Palm Pilot kind of device. And so I built a community for that, and then I built communities for hacking cell phones for a bunch of years, and then did some ringtone stuff. And it's really a dark world that I try not to talk about. I just try and replace it with that one slide that has a couple dots on it and just hope no one asks. Yeah, another follow-up?
Yeah, just the reason that I asked is, you get A players hire A players and building a great team, but there are a lot of people that are not in an ideal situation trying to build a great team. Right?
Yep.
Where you're not surrounded by A players, but you're going to try and attract A players to a non-A player culture.
Yep.
Right?
I think the question is, how do you attract A players to a non-A player culture? I think a lot of this goes into, and I probably didn't describe it well, but the always be closing. One of the things that I've found is when you're especially trying to hire engineers, whether it's to a product, to collaborate, or to whatever, one of the most important things is telling a compelling story. And there's a great book called Drive by Daniel Pink, and a lot of it talks about motivation, why people are doing things. And I'm guessing it's not usually for money. I wasn't going to put a hands up thing, but I did it. It probably wouldn't go very well. But it's usually, people aren't usually doing these things for money. I certainly have found myself wishing I was. And I definitely have friends who are. But for the most part, the engineers I'm hiring usually, or the people I'm working with, they're not there for the financial reward. They're there because the problem is interesting. And the interesting problem could be, help me get out of the culture of B's and C's. That could be the pitch. And so there's a lot that you can do on building on what you have and just saying, hey, we need to solve this problem. And that's worked well for me. And it hasn't always been as easy. I mean, hiring for the presidential campaign was pretty much yes or wrong team. That was pretty much it. But so that doesn't count as much. But just even finding interactions or trying to find people to collaborate with, it's all about the pitching and selling of the problem. Yeah.
How long did it take you to hire your team?
So the question is, how long did it take me to hire my team? On the campaign, we did about 40 people in about 3 months. Which was ridiculous. The campaign also hired about 7,500 people in about 9 months, which I think is also ridiculous. And we once onboarded 100 interns in one day, which was like stacking firewood. It was ridiculous. Yeah?
What's the license on the campaign product?
The license on the campaign product. So the question is about the campaign product. The campaign product is not released. I am pushing for MIT. I figure that one's about the most reasonable license that we can do for something that could be used for commercial use. Other questions? Yeah?
You said you go to Python now. Do you feel like PHP is dead?
The question is about Python versus PHP. Absolutely not. I think that PHP is an incredibly viable language for anything. I just haven't been doing it very, very often. So I check out Kohana, and I'm just like, what is going on? And they have this new installer for packages. What is this called? Like a Composer or some shit like that? What is it? Do you know what I'm talking about? Is it Composer? Well, Pair too, but Composer is the one. It's for installing PHP packages, and I just don't know how to use it. And I just, for whatever reason, I can't figure it out. I keep trying. I would love someone to tell me. But PHP. So PHP really did power all of our fundraising on the campaign. And so when people say, PHP won't work for important applications, that's about as important as you can get and about as sensitive since you're dealing with credit cards, personal information, and it's a low latency application. And so we had Python, we had Ruby, we had C, and we chose PHP for the finance apps. That was also because we knew it could be fast and it scales easy. You don't have to use app servers. So I would choose it again, and I think it's one of the things I think is really important is not thinking about the tools, thinking about the solutions. And so if you're thinking about whether PHP or Python is better, you're probably in the wrong place. Yeah?
How do you stay up to date with the latest open source projects out there?
Question is, how do I stay up to date with the latest open source products? I sadly rely on my friends. I should say I sadly don't, so I rely on my friends. I should phrase that differently instead of saying I sadly rely on my friends. But what I found is there was a time when I was able to really keep up with the open source world, and a lot of that was through conferences and just going to all of the sessions. And that's how I met Mark, and that's how I met many people at like the MySQL conferences, which I spent a lot of time with at. And what I found is going to places like this, these type of conferences that are more general, where people are talking about all the technologies, you get to hear great things like about FreedomBox and about all of these things, rather than going to the very specific ones. Now with that said, some of the best, I think, discovery that I've ever done has been at the MySQL conference back when it was hot. And the reason that was because it was such a nugget in the middle of a lot of people's infrastructures that you'd have good conversations about the surrounding orbits and not just that one. And so if there's, probably the Hadoop conferences might be similar to this. The other thing is I love clicking on Explore in GitHub. You can find all sorts of interesting things there. Yeah?
Do you have any recommendations on how to get people excited about civic hacking?
No. I sort of do. So the problem with civic hacking in politics, if you guys ever want to go into it, is that it totally blows. That's because it just sucks. It's like you just are beating your head against a wall over and over again. And it's because most of them are huge, monolithic institutions that invested sadly in Oracle like 5 years ago. And they're just like, well, until that's paid for, we're not changing anything. And so this is how you do it. And it's very simple. You make it short term. So you just say, for the next 12 months, you'll be helping in this world. And that way, every day when it sucks, you're like, well, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And that's honestly how we did it with the campaign, which it wasn't that the technology was bad. It was really intense. And that's how we do it in Chicago with our civic hacking stuff. The other thing that I believe in is oftentimes you can get people excited with civic hacking by just doing it. And so I reverse engineered the CTA, the transit application or the API for Chicago, and just published it. You have to be careful because you can go to jail sometimes. So be wary. But if you're in a place that you feel is helpful, for instance, I knew some of the CTA people, and so I was able to tell them right away what we had done. And so that would have been a simple conversation like, hey, you shouldn't do that, instead of like a cease and desist or something more nefarious and chilling. Yeah?
How much of all the stuff that you built at OFA with your team, how much of that do you think will be repurposed for future elections?
That's a good question. So the question is, how much of what we built at OFA will be repurposed for future elections? Sadly, it's software, so bit rot is very real. If we were going to run an election in 2011, it'd be perfect. But there's a few things there's a few like DevOps tools and some more kind of like middle technology tools that I think will really help. And that will help everyone, not just campaigns. What I really hope people take away, like the Democrats or the Republicans, they're both talking about it, and they're both going to be struggling with the same issues in 2016. What I hope the takeaway is about the people and the process, about using iterative development. For instance, when I walked into the campaign, there was no version control. So that's kind of where they were, and I'm pretty sure that's where a lot of these organizations are. The DNC did have a Git repo, but they weren't using GitHub. They weren't using collaborative tools. And so introducing that, I think that's kind of the culture virus that I would like to continue more than the software. Yeah?
How did your work relate to Vote Builder?
So Vote Builder, the question is, how did my work relate to Vote Builder? So Vote Builder is a kind of a CRM for progressive politics that the Democrats use quite a bit. We integrated aggressively with Vote Builder and shared data between Vote Builder and my own software or my team's software. So that's kind of how we did it. Van's great. It looks like it's built with the Visual Studio visual designer, like drag and drop, but it works like a beast. I've never said that about a Microsoft product before. It's not Microsoft, but it was built on .NET. Yeah?
My question, I want to try to word it right, but like I'm sure the technological challenge of going into that campaign and doing that software was amazing. But then you also have the ideological, if the Republicans had asked to do the same thing, and you'd never gotten that other opportunity, would you take it for the technology, even if you didn't necessarily agree with the result? Or, you know, how much
Yeah.
of that played into the...
So the question is, how much of the ideology, I think, did the engineers, like, would we do it, if it was an opportunity, would you do it for the other side? Many of the people we hired were there for the candidate. A lot of them weren't even really identified as Democrats. They just identified as people who supported the president, which I find is a big distinction. I have many friends who worked on Romney, and I think it was very much similar for them. So I think that the ideology kind of is important for that, especially because it's such a big and crazy thing that you're doing, and it's really hard. I think it has to match. Now, with that said, I think there are a lot of opportunities to do products like this where your ideology doesn't necessarily match. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a very hard question. I think it's almost a personal choice. Personally, I was a supporter of the president, so I knew that I wanted to do it. But that leads to the next question of, would I do another campaign? And there's no way.
Well, and I guess it would tie in with the team.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know,
Now,
when you're building a team, if they don't connect, they may love the challenge, but they
Yep.
may not connect with the ideology
And
of
so
how
this-
you're doing it.
so this goes a little bit to like, how do you build a good team and that kind of question, which is, we need to share values. Now, hopefully you guys aren't doing national campaigns, so you can work on a small project and you can share values that are a little bit less political. But sharing values is really important. And so we all knew, and the people I hired, we all agreed that we should be building big software that used platforms, and that we were going to focus aggressively on APIs, and we were going to use open standards and all this stuff. And so we looked for people that knew that, both in our search and when we hired people, brought them in, we made sure that they supported that. And so that kind of, we shared this open source and open standards ideology. And a lot of the work we did to integrate with Vote Builder or BSD, we tried to push out standards that we built internally that we hoped would live on. And so a lot of that ideology was matching no matter where you came from. And I think that's important that for a team to really gel like that. I mean, and it's probably as hard as, you know, if two people disagree on language. You know, I mean, it's just not going to work very well. So you should use Go. Yeah.
Particularly given that you said you had some friends that were working on the Romney campaign, do you have any insight as to the just massive IT infrastructure fail those guys?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I can just honestly probably talk shit. Really, what happened was it was a lack of empowerment of the technologists. And you have to look at what the landscape was. We had 18 months. They really had 3 or 4. So this is why I think 2016 is going to be very similar to what the Republicans went through, is because there isn't a foundational technology for either side. And when I talked to my friends that were inside of the Romney campaign, what they talked about was a lack of investment. So this young kid would build a cool product, and then it would get nixed by the political group. You know, whereas we would have a young kid build a cool product, and then it would be looked at by the campaign manager. So that's kind of, I think, a big difference. And it was just, we chose to really invest in technology at a very, very early time period where they kind of, I think, just now are realizing how important it is to invest and empower technologists. Now, with that said, technology is only a force multiplier in these situations. It is never the reason. And so you have to remember that as well. And that's my worry for 2016, that the narrative that comes off of the campaign will be that technology should be the focus. Yeah, in the back.
Are there any startups out there right now that you would use as a benchmark for team dynamic?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Are there startups that I use as a benchmark for team dynamic? I think the #1 engineering team in the country is Etsy. Number 2, for an interesting reason, is Palantir. They're all hackers. And since I do client work, a lot of it is very fast, insane hacking work to do. So it's interesting to see what they're doing. But by far, #1 is Etsy. I'm very excited about Stripe. Stripe is doing very cool stuff, and they're building a very smart team. And then I'm constantly surprised by Dropbox, which I think is going to be the new Google for hiring. Probably not search, but you never know. Yeah.
You talked about trying to get Narwhal released. So that's probably the example of the most competitive space possible. So how in really competitive industries do you encourage companies to release source code and
Yeah,
and
this is a
embrace open source going
this is a really good question. How do in competitive industries, why should you release your code? I think there's a couple things that you can do. When I look at open source, I look at it as almost one of the best recruiting tools out there. And so I would not release your most competitive piece of software, but you can release a lot of things surrounding it. A great example of this is automation. So if you have a big app, like look, Airbnb releases great automation tools all the time. So does Stripes. So does, my favorite is, I don't know how many of you guys play Minecraft. Mindfold is this Minecraft server. The young kid does. Anyway, Mindfold, they release all this stuff about Minecraft, like how to, like Minecraft bots, all this stuff. So it's not their core technology, but it's the auxiliary technology around it. And what it does is it attracts people to their product that are like us. So we go in there and we're like, oh, that's really awesome. I should use Airbnb. But more importantly, it gives them, if more people adopt it, like StatsD and Graphite came from Etsy. If people adopt it, we can commit a patch back that solves our problem that may solve some other people's problem. So I got time for one more question. Yeah, right in the front.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? Any other questions? What's next for me? I'm still trying to figure that out. I have a small team and we have a small company, and we're focusing on commerce. I used to say we're focusing on enterprise, which is still true, but more on the commerce side. So if you play that back, you heard I just didn't say anything. We're trying to figure out what the future of commerce looks like and kind of what are some of the exciting things that we can do with the internet and buying things. Yeah, probably I have time for one-half of a question, since that one is an easy one. Okay, half of a question.
I just have a quick
That's
question.
it?
As a student, how can I convince, I get open source, I understand it, love it, great idea. How can I get faculty, students, other people to understand why open source needs to be brought into our curriculum, why it's so important? How can you convince the naysayers?
What age? Or what is it college?
It is.
Probably find the person that's working closest to get the contracts with Microsoft and convince them. Because usually a lot of the FUD is coming from corporate. Because I guarantee that a lot of your comp sci students would be thrilled to do that, mostly because it's free and accessible. And right now it's not necessarily, I think, about piracy. It's more about what is accessible. And there's a lot of accessible open source software. Because of that, a lot of the corporate and licensed software has a vested interest in trying to move into our schools. You may remember the Coke machines of our elementary schools. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. It was great to chat, and I'd love to chat later.